Thank you for joining us today. We are joined by Murray Hiebert. We're going to be hosting a launch of Murray's new book that I'm sure everybody is eagerly awaiting. Without much ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Murray, and then we're going to have a discussion before we throw it to Q&A. But first, some housekeeping. This event is made possible by general support from CSIS. I'm sure a lot of people on here have gotten used to this new world of Zoom events, but for those who haven't, the way we're going to run this is that there's a Q&A function on Zoom to allow you to ask questions to Murray, and we'll be able to go ahead and see the questions. When you type them into the Q&A function, I'd ask that you please identify your name and your affiliation so Murray knows who he's talking to. And let me give Murray the brief introduction that he certainly deserves more time for, but Murray is a senior associate with the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS. He earlier served as a senior advisor and deputy director of the Southeast Asia Program at CSIS since 2011, I think. And Murray is in large part responsible for my career, so anything I've done poorly over the years rests with him. Prior to joining the CSIS, Murray was the senior director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And before that, he was a journalist in the China Bureau at the Wall Street Journal, and for many years with the Far Eastern Economic Review across Southeast Asia, including Kuala Lumpur and Hanoi. And with that, I'd like to just get started with Murray, who everybody really wants to hear from. So, Murray, without further ado, tell us about the book. What's it called? What's it about?
Thanks, Greg. Before I do that, I'd just like to, thank you very much for organizing this, you and Andreka. It's a real privilege to be on this platform with you guys. I would just also, if we had a real audience, I could see who's there and give shout outs to people that have contributed to this book, because ultimately when you're writing about 10 countries plus some external players like China and the US, a lot of people have contributed to your understanding. So lots of officials, diplomats, academics, economists, business people, journalists, civil society, goes on, and just ordinary guys on the street, people in the street have done a lot to help me understand Southeast Asia, give me pictures of what's happening in their country. Many of them spoke off the record, but I'd like to thank all these people, and they're not to blame for what I wrote. That's me, but they did help me get some understanding. So the book is called Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia's China Challenge. It is a book that tells the tries to tell a story about how Southeast Asia is responding to China's rise. It does this country by country, and it's fair to say that many of the countries are very different from each other, but some are big, some are small, etc. But all the countries, I think one generalization you can make, they respond to China with a mix of hope and anxiety, anticipation and unease. They do almost to everybody appreciates China's economic rise and the role it's playing in boosting the economies in the region. Trade with China is a huge factor for all the countries. China is, for almost all of them, the largest trading partner, and it has been for a number of years. With the Belt and Road Initiative, China's infrastructure project that it's taken around the world, but it's focused a lot on Southeast Asia, that is struggling harder, I think, to get traction. You'd think it was going well reading the newspapers because they get a lot of positive coverage, but it's really a struggle for China. Some countries are just holding them off at arm's length. Others keep negotiating for years. These projects have problems getting land. They have trouble getting local permits. There are a lot of struggles, and so it's a lot slower than many people would have thought. The Mekong is increasingly, we're becoming aware of China's role on Southeast Asia through the Mekong. China has built 11 dams on the upper reaches of the Mekong and built several on the lower reaches, including 2 in Laos. And we're now discovering, thanks to some recent satellite photos from a group called Eyes on the Earth, coupled with work by Stimson Center, that China is holding back a lot of water behind these dams. And this is causing a lot of the drought that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, in mainland Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam last year, and it looks like it's going to be the same situation this year. The countries bordering on the South China Sea, for those of you that follow Southeast Asia and you follow Greg, you know that four Southeast Asian countries have competing claims, and they are having quite a few tensions with China in the South China Sea. And for the last few years, China has put a lot of pressure on their efforts to exploit hydrocarbons from the South China Sea. I look also at the role of the ethnic Chinese, the ones going way back, but also there's a lot of new ones in the last 2 decades, and including in the last decade, and northern Myanmar, northern Laos, Vientiane, Bangkok, Manila. This surge, I think, could in the longer run have quite a bit of impact on Southeast Asia. China has many different tools in its toolbox. Some are, soft power, like scholarships, Confucian institutions to teach Mandarin, lots of invitations to government officials, academics, journalists, religious leaders to visit China. China also has some attempts at influencing political views and activities in countries. We see this a little bit in the Philippines, a little bit in Singapore, but it's not really as obvious as it is in places like New Zealand and Australia. So the book finished before COVID hit, and the most recent increased tensions between China and the US. But Southeast Asia is quite anxious about the last development. They don't want to choose sides, as you hear regularly. They're very worried about a bifurcation of the economy and the technology sphere. So, Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Murray. So, I mean, a lot of these are trends that you and many others have been watching for years. But when you start researching a book, you tend to surprise yourself with things you uncover, right? So what in the process of writing the book, what trends did you find that you kind of thought you knew about but surprised you the most?
Well, one I already alluded to, and that is the challenges China faces on the Belt and Road. In Laos, little Laos, with its 8 million people and less than $20 billion GDP, stood up to China for 5 years, and they negotiated the interest rates, they negotiated how much land China would get on each side of the railroad, and it was very difficult. And Myanmar, a country that has been isolated internationally since 2017, when the Rohingya were expelled, it is really standing up to China on their Belt and Road projects. They think a lot of what China's offering them, like the Chakpu port on the Indian Ocean, is going to help China more. And they have really also stood up to China and really resisted taking China's initial offers. The other thing that surprised me actually is the Philippines on this whole issue. After the arbitral tribunal ruling against China in the South China Sea, it basically accepted what Philippine claims against those of China. Then a few months later, Duterte, their president who'd been elected, Rodrigo Duterte, who'd been elected a few months earlier, he goes to China, signs MOUs worth $24 billion to build projects. You would think and Duterte did tell the Chinese, actually, I needed to say this, that he was going to put the ruling aside. He was going to divorce from the United States. And then he negotiates all these agreements, and China, nothing's happening. They are not getting negotiated. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but some of the projects are grinding to not going anywhere because the companies don't have money. Others because of tough rules and regulations in the Philippines. Some collapse because of the ban on mining that Duterte had imposed. But you'd think China would move heaven and earth, but no. They built 2 little bridges since Duterte's visit three years ago. And I guess I'm surprised at that. And in fact, instead of building projects, they kept harassing China in the South China Sea. One little point, which I thought was interesting, is that Myanmar really doesn't have, which is next to China, been living next to China for hundreds of years, has no China experts. So that's something, and then something that actually, interestingly, the Irrawaddy newspaper pointed out last week in an editorial, said, how can we understand China and know what it wants if we don't have any China experts who can interpret China's foreign policy, economic policy, etc. And then one tiny historical point, I'll try to tell it very briefly, but after the communist victory in China, Thailand very quickly tried to find ways to make sure China wouldn't do anything to them. And they began negotiations at quite a high level, including foreign minister level. And they signed agreements, and China invited monks and members of parliament and journalists, etc. And then Thailand was then weighing whether it was going to go with China or go with the United States, which was getting increasingly involved in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. Then in 1957, there's a coup, and in Thailand, Pibu Songkram was overthrown by Air Marshal Sarit, and then that ended. But and some of the people got thrown in jail that were working on this China liaison activity. Well, interestingly, and this has the U.S. angle, in 1966, Lyndon Johnson was facing lots of problems in Vietnam, as we know, and problems with his re-election here in the U.S. He had diplomats approach the Thais who had been involved in the rapprochement efforts with China earlier on. He arranged to have a letter delivered by diplomats, and this guy whose name is Sang travels to China. He arrives there just as the Red Guard had taken over the foreign ministry. So he's expelled, and the giant hanging question is, what would have happened if Lyndon Johnson's letter, which offered talks to normalize ties and talks about how to address the conflict in Southeast Asia? Over to you, Greg.
Thanks. You alluded to this already. So you finished the book some months ago, and then the world changed with coronavirus, with the resultant spike in U.S.-China tensions. If you had a chance, what developments have happened since you wrapped up the book that you wish you had a chance to get in there?
Yeah, well, the COVID is really a big deal, and I wish I could have talked about that. But so when the COVID hits Wuhan and starts spreading, China closed all its borders. That meant suddenly a lot of the economic trade that I was talking about, there were, Vietnam couldn't import components for its garments supply chain. Myanmar and Vietnam were left suddenly hanging with tons of ag products. Chinese tourists, who are a huge beneficiary to all these countries in Southeast Asia, they're by far the largest group. And tourism is just ground to a halt in Thailand, for example, where 10 to 12% of its GDP is made up simply made up by tourist activities spending. And so, that's been one impact, and that tourists still aren't back. The border is much more open. but at the same time, you've had companies who had trouble supplying things from the supply chain in China. American companies, European, Southeast Asian, realized they had trouble getting some inputs for medicine and medical equipment. And so many are considering moving at least part of their activities to places like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. At the same time, China is using, we don't know yet what the impact will be on the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road had slowed down in recent years, since 2015, basically. It's gone down every year, but it's really expected to be quite slow this year because China needs a lot of this money to get its own economy back up and running. China gave quite a bit of COVID fighting equipment to Southeast Asia. In some countries like Malaysia, there's a lot of questioning after what happened in Europe, whether these kits are reliable. Then China gave some aid like masks and PEs, but then China also always had big ceremonies. So in Myanmar, you see them constantly giving a small donation from either the government or a company and having huge ceremonies that are covered in the media. The other thing, which I alluded to, is the US-China Cold War, let's call it for short. China-US tensions had been growing since early in the Trump administration, but that's really ratcheted up in recent months. And there's a lot of anxiety in Southeast Asian countries about the impact of extended hostilities. And if concern about whether this will result in a bifurcation of the global supply chain, of which many of the more developed economies in Southeast Asia are key parts of. And they're also worried about the bifurcation of technology, especially as President Trump puts pressures, and they've moved way beyond Huawei and TikTok. He's now talking WeChat and even Alibaba. And Southeast Asia is critical economic partner for both the United States and China, and they really don't want to choose. And they fear everybody is going to lose, China, US, and them, if this continues. I guess a couple of smaller things, or that I didn't cover, Hun Sen in Cambodia, who's probably the friendliest government to China, gives them the least grief, under pressure from China, shut down a lot of the online gaming that was happening. There's a lot of online gaming in Sihanoukville in Cambodia. There's a lot going on in Manila. It's aimed only at the Chinese in China, not at anybody else. And China put pressure on Hun Sen to shut these down. So a lot of these guys have now moved to other places. And there's, in Karen State, right across the border from Thailand, some of these guys are setting up operations and building giant casinos and hotels like they have in Sihanoukville. Shui Koko is the most famous of these so far. It's really, some people think, and this is a really important point I actually should have made. A lot of things that China is doing are blamed on the government. There's lots of different actors in China, like in the United States. You have the central government that does some stuff, the provincial government, and then you have state-owned enterprises, and then you have let's just call them cowboys or maybe entrepreneurs. But those guys, a lot of this stuff is being done by them, including what's happening in the casinos in Karen State in Myanmar. Then the other thing I guess I could mention is Malaysia. It gave me fits. It's usually one of the most stable governments in Southeast Asia. I wrote the chapter assuming that Najib would win the elections. He lost and Mahathir came back in 2018. And I blissfully sent the book off to the publisher. And then in February, Moyadeen became the new prime minister under a palace coup. So those are a couple of things, Greg.
Great. Well, let me ask one more question, and then the queue's starting to fill up, so we'll toss it to the audience. And in preparation, I just remind everybody, please do get some questions in, and when you do, identify yourself and your institution, so I can let Murray know who he's going to get in trouble with when he responds. So I mean, you alluded repeatedly to Southeast Asia's longstanding position that we don't want to choose. So what is your recommendation for U.S. administration, this one or next one? How do you help Southeast Asian partners hedge against the more negative aspects of Chinese influence without boxing them in, without making them feel like they're being forced to choose?
Yeah, tough question. I dealt with this a little bit right at the end of the book. Obviously, that wasn't the topic of the book, so I didn't go into it in great length, but I did talk to Southeast Asians along the way about this. One of the things they said is, for heaven's sake, just show up. We have lots of meetings. I know you find our Association of Southeast Asian nations or ASEAN meetings or our APEC meetings, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings, really boring and stuff, but a lot of stuff happens there. And so it would be useful. Under the previous administration, US did pretty well. This one has been a little bit hit and miss. And so that's obviously noted. The other thing they say almost to a country is find some vehicle to economically engage us. This administration pull it out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we need you to have vehicles to stay economically engaged with us. If you don't want to go back to the TPP, then find another vehicle, but find some way that we can reliably work together beyond tariffs, which countries like Vietnam have come under a lot of threats of tariffs because of their trade and surplus with the United States. The US can't do very much to compete with China. And there's a third point, can't do much to compete with China on infrastructure. And recently, the US has established the Development Finance Corporation, part of the old OPEC, successor to the old OPEC. It's been a little slow getting off the ground because of congressional funding, but the goal of the DFC is to promote private investment as an alternative to China's state-directed investment. And it's slowly getting going now, but it would be it's really important to get it going soon so that countries have alternatives to depending so much on China for infrastructure. Some Southeast Asians, and this will give heartburn to US officials, but said the US should actually join BRI so that you're inside, you can push for transparency and reining in corruption, and pushing for strong labor standards, strong environmental standards. And some also pushed for US joining the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, like some other countries like Australia have done to dilute China's voting power and press for higher standards. The US has since the middle of last year, the fourth issue, woken up more on the Mekong, and is playing a more active role, which is good to see. Secretary Pompeo made some really strong statements about China's activities, including hoarding water behind their dams, and that announced some projects with Japan, a project with Japan on US Mekong Power, which will help with power grids. Another one with Australia, which will help deal with crime and in the lower Mekong. And I guess we could talk about South China Sea. Your program, Greg, has talked a lot about recommendations. I think Southeast Asians, many are very thankful that the US explained finally about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, about what exactly it was standing for, and that it strongly endorsed the arbitral tribunal and what it had called for. So yeah, I'll stop there. Turn to the audience.
Great. Well, we've gotten questions on basically all of these. So let's start doing some deep dives. First question will go to Ambassador Dave Scheer. Dave wants to know whether or not the Mekong states, the Southeast Asian Mekong states, are speaking to China with one voice. And as a follow-up, has the U.S. Lower Mekong Initiative had any effect at all?
Thanks, David. Good to hear you via Greg. um, uh, the Southeast Asians are trying to figure out, I guess it'd be one way to say it, what to do on the Mekong. Um, they haven't, so when after the Eye on the World released its photos, the Mekong Committee, and it did this again earlier, just about a month ago, it released statements saying that, well, we don't know exactly what the cause of the water shortage is. It could be El Nino, it could be various other rain not being sufficient, etc. They do not want to challenge China, and Vietnam is staying within that space. And I think if the Mekong countries, maybe led by Thailand and Vietnam, could confront China, obviously diplomatically and maybe not over the airwaves, but go talk to them and say, you know, this is pretty awful. You're, by saving water for behind your dam so you'll have water for generating electricity year round, you're devastating the lower Mekong, along which about 60 million people live and make their livings through fishing and farming. So far, China has given no indication that it recognizes what these concerns are. And therefore, I think, you know, it's up to the international community to also give voice to what they're concerned about and help ASEAN and China find ways to equitably share the water. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Let's see. We have next question from Phan Nhut Minh Chang from Vietnam National University. Min wants to know whether or not, let me shorten this one, is China pursuing a new form of a tributary relationship with Southeast Asia? Does China still expect that the region is its backyard and that Southeast Asia will inevitably have to be subservient to China in one form or another?
Well, maybe I should throw that question back to you. You know, I avoided that language in the book. I referred to it a few times in the history section, and I do know that, you know, countries like Vietnam had to pay tribute for millennia, well, maybe not millennia, for centuries. You know, yeah, I mean, I think what China views Southeast Asia very much as its backyard. Living in a big country from which I'm speaking, I think we know a little bit about what happens when big countries live next to little ones. Little ones sometimes feel that they have to toe the line unduly and aren't allowed to make their own decisions. But China, you know, economically views Southeast Asia as, you know, a major source of raw materials like coal and minerals from Indonesia. It's a source to sell their stuff. They would like Southeast Asia not to stand up to them and be more cooperative. They never use tribute language at this point. But, you know, if the Belt and Road gets built and China does blast open the Mekong like it wants to, there are big rocks at Chiang Rai near Luang Prabang in Laos. So there are big rocks that keep the Chinese heavy boats from coming down. They would really like to do that and come all the way down into the southern Vietnam Mekong Delta. The Thais are standing up to them on this, which is interesting because Thailand does try to cooperate with China as much as it can. But I think I would, you know, it is a, you know, I guess it's not like China doesn't have its own Monroe Doctrine a little bit, but I guess I would also say that we don't quite know where China's going to end up. I think China was a little less assertive prior to Xi Jinping taking office in 2012, but Yeah, I'm not going to say that they want them to be tributary states, but you know it's going to get a little close to that in some cases. And some cases, I think, like Cambodia, it's maybe almost there already.
Great. I'm going to try to bundle some questions that are pretty similar. So we've got our friend Vikram Nehru and Richard Borsuk are both asking whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic is going to leave long-lasting damage on the China-Southeast Asia relationship.
I don't think so. Yes, they say China was a little slow to take action, and they know where the COVID came from, but they think China made a pretty heroic effort at the end to stop it. And it really hasn't been a big issue in any of their immediate countries, any of the countries along the border. It became a much bigger issue in the Philippines and in Indonesia, which are island archipelagos quite far off the mainland. And there it's probably a factor of them not being quite aggressive enough in trying to control it. Economically, I mean, they're frustrated at what happened initially. Some of them are a little bit happy that they're going to get investment from China. There's going to be reshoring of investment from China to Southeast Asia. I'm not sure that that's going to be a big deal. I would say, you know, they're much more frustrated what's happening in the United States. They just wonder why the US can't get a grip on this with having some of the world's smartest scientists, health experts, and here we go, you know, just letting it go. So it's not like they don't notice what's happening here.
Let's switch gears to talk about the other partner that doesn't get enough attention, which is Japan. So George Abani asked how Japan is going to play in its infrastructure game in Southeast Asia. How is Japan trying to provide alternatives to China? And James Zumwalt asked how the U.S. can better partner with Japan to hedge against China in Southeast Asia. Do you have any thoughts on the role Tokyo plays here?
Yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the things that awaits Southeast Asians realizing they're going to be caught between an assertive China and sometimes present, sometimes not United States, is to boost relations with other countries. So they have really worked overtime on relations with Japan, Australia, India, South Korea, and Europe, the EU. And with Japan, the US and Japan do cooperate on a number of things already, but especially on maritime domain awareness. So both countries are providing, for example, to Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, either radar equipment or small Navy boats to go patrolling to figure out what's going on in the South China Sea. Japan does have its own infrastructure project. Southeast Asians like it. They just say there's too little and it's too slow. They say negotiating a project with the Chinese can take forever, but their interest rate is 0.75%, while the Chinese start somewhere at 4 or 4.5%. And that's what the Lao and the Thais have been negotiating over. But there is a prime example. There's a sort of in the book I use this headline, Tale of Two Subways in Vietnam. And China has been working since 2011 on a sky train in Hanoi. It's about 7.5 miles long. They have been going on this thing for a long time. It was supposed to be done around 2017. They ran out of money. China had to kick in more, and Vietnam had to kick in more money. It's still not finished, and now they're squabbling over exactly how they have to deal with getting safety certification. Vietnamese economists will describe this project as the definition of corruption par excellence by both the Chinese and the Vietnamese, two good communist allies. And then I should mention, there have been several accidents. Rolls of steel fell off the railroad a couple of years ago at the construction site and killed a guy in a motorcycle and and injured some passersby. Same thing happened about a month later and fell on a taxi, trapped 3 people, but they all survived. Then you have the subway in Ho Chi Minh City that is going along. It's a little slow. It's also got cost overruns, but the project in Hanoi is really an eyesore, and it's not. You know, you ever notice that China does not put this on their posters about the Belt and Road? But Japan could do more, and I think under the DFC, that would be useful for the U.S. and Japan to work together. They could have a consortium of Japanese and American companies bidding on a project, doing feasibility studies, helping with some of the technology and IT stuff needed for projects. I know I can tell you Japan's projects are very popular, but like I said, too slow.
Great. We've got a lot of questions about the BRI. Ekaterina Koldanova with the ASEAN Center in Moscow asked whether or not you think China is responsive to the pushback that you've talked about from Southeast Asian states, or does it just push harder?
No, that's another thing. You know, you just can't say everything in a few minutes, but yes, it is interesting. So on Laos, just for example, they started at 4% interest. Then the Thais were offered 2%. So Laos went back and said, you got to deal with that issue. And then China insisted on wanting about, this is in meters, but I'll try to translate it into yards or something. They wanted about 55 yards on each side of the railroad, which, as you know, in an Asian situation, along railroads, there's lots of shops, hotels, guest houses. That's a good way to make money. And so China was going to get that much. They wanted that much land. They got them now. Laos bargained them down, little tiny Laos, mind you, this down to 16 meters, yards. So, and they, you know, China agreed to that, to keep the project going. Now, what's happened to the poor Lao, the other thing I didn't mention, the Chinese wanted Laos to borrow all the money from China, which would have been something like, at that point, 5 years ago, about 2/3 of their GDP, $7 billion. And they finally, in the end, negotiated that there'd be a joint Lao-China company. They would take a lot of the debt, and the Lao government would only need to put in about 700 million. Much of that is used for resettling villagers, and that's not happening very efficiently. So there's some complaining about that. Same story in, well, the Thais, you know, the Chinese and the Thais have been negotiating since 2014 when the Thai generals took over the government, and they did offer Thailand a cheaper interest rate, but the Thais realized they could get even better rates on the international market. But the Chinese wanted to do a rice deal for the loan initially, which the Thais told them they could go jump on that topic. They wanted to have their own engineers. They wanted Thailand, which has equipment from other countries. They wanted Thailand only to take Chinese equipment. And so they've been haggling, and they've had more than 25 rounds of negotiations. And a former colleague of mine in Bangkok who's broken the story that the Chinese actually asked the Thais to fire that's Sean Crispin, they asked the Thais to fire their transport minister. And Myanmar too, you know, they wanted Myanmar to borrow all the money, and they wanted include for the Chukpu Dam. The Chukpu port, which is on the Indian Ocean, really would only benefit China. There's not much benefit in it for Myanmar. Their production is far away from Rakhine State. And so and then you saw what happened at the Belt and Road Summit last year in was it about April 2019. Xi Jinping's speech, he talked about he was much more humble than he had been in 2017, and talked about needing to rein in corruption, be more transparent, listen more to the people, that kind of stuff. So yeah, China is actually quite responsive if they get pushback on the BRI.
Our colleague at CSIS, Bonnie Glazer, has a question on a topic that we rarely discuss here, the South China Sea. So Bonnie wants to know what you make of the long-term impact of Chinese pressure on energy development, offshore energy development for Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, etc.
Yeah, good one, Bonnie, thanks. Yeah, so I don't know exactly where this is going to end up. You know, it's obvious that Philippines has been held back since 2011 from developing one of its concession in Reed Bank. It's Reed Bank, right, Greg? Yeah, and the Malaysians tell me they think China is going to let Shell, which has been operating off the southern coast of Sarawak, of Laconia Reef for decades. They're going to let them get away with it. I'm not so sure. I think as we've seen China ratchet up the pressure, I think it's quite possible that relationship will be challenged quite severely. And then we've seen what happened with Vietnam, where they were forced to give up a deal in 2018 with Repsol, a Spanish company. And I think the only reason that they survived last year off Vanguard Bank was because of the Rosneft being a Russian company, and Russians aren't easily intimidated. But I think it looks to me like China is moving to say you can really do these projects and you can use foreign companies, but they have to be Chinese. The problem is that some countries like the Philippines have constitutions that don't allow it, because China won't make statements that just because we do a joint venture doesn't mean that has claims for ownership. So yeah, we're in for a bucking bronco ride here for a while, I think, and don't know exactly where China will end up. They need a lot of pressure on them, I think, to slow down some of this assertiveness on the hydrocarbons, or it's going to have a huge impact on these countries. Like in the Philippines, you know, they were looking for this gas field in Reed Bank to fire their power in Manila. The monies that Malaysia gets used to be, before the energy price collapsed, over 20% of the government revenue, and in Vietnam, which desperately short of electricity, and really was hoping to use some of these the gas fields off its shores, and now it really can't plan properly. And you know, ExxonMobil is working on a project, an announced project. You know, we don't know if China will put a lot of pressure on and sort of unravel that project going forward, or if ExxonMobil, being quite big, wants to stand up to them. I don't know the answer.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Linda Yar from George Washington University asked about Chinese surveillance technology. So you do see quite a bit of coverage in the press, but I'm not sure Washington pays enough attention to the acceptance of Chinese standards on surveillance technology and the export of China's, you know, what some people are calling the techno-authoritarian model to Southeast Asia. How widely do you think Southeast Asian states are likely to kind of follow in China's footsteps on this?
You know, it's interesting. Every country is a little bit different. Some of the smaller ones are just accepting Huawei developing 5G, for example. Singapore recently announced that it wouldn't, and Vietnam is going its own way also. But it's interesting for its cybersecurity law that Vietnam has gone dangerously close to following the model from China. And China is inviting officials from places like Vietnam, the Philippines, and the smaller countries to come to China to learn about how China is controlling the internet. On surveillance technology, we even have some Chinese surveillance technology now, and at least it was installed in the Singapore airport. I think it's in the fourth terminal. We have, it's been installed in various cities in Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Philippines. Yeah, artificial intelligence with help from China is being widely used with investments from Chinese companies. And you know, the more that a lot of it is very concessional terms that US companies, for example, can't even compete with. So it's really getting them hooked much more into the Chinese system. The other thing I haven't mentioned is that one of the areas in which China is most actively involved in investment, and investment has still been behind the US and Japan till now, but it's catching up. But in the IT space, in the e-commerce, and a lot of the you know, the ride sharing and the those kind of areas, China is investing big time. Alibaba and what's the owners of WeChat? Those companies are really very active and just I mean, US companies are very small players. So yeah, in the IT space, China is really making hay.
We have a question from Michael Anderson on Malaysia, and there was a couple others on this. Basically, do you see any real change in Malaysian policy toward either Washington or Beijing in the post-Mahathir era?
So the current Prime Minister, Muhyiddin, he's obviously had to spend most of his time focused on dealing with COVID and the economic byproducts of COVID. So he hasn't really focused on foreign policy very much. He never was. Under Mahathir, he was Home Affairs Minister and various Education Minister, I believe. He hasn't really been terribly active in the foreign policy space. We haven't seen many overtures to the United States. He hasn't visited China, for example, but last week, Foreign Minister Hishamuddin, Malaysia did present a note verbal to the UN again about its claims in the South China Sea and differentiating its claims from those of China. Last week, Hishamuddin, the new foreign minister, he reiterated some of these things, that the parts of the South China Sea that are ours, please leave us alone. That was a pretty strong statement for Hishamuddin, who has been over the years quite close to China. He's also been close to the US, actually, when he was defense minister. But I think that might say something, but Malaysia has always had a soft spot for China. They were the first country to normalize relations in 1974, even beat the Thais by a year. They are really integrated economically, and are, you know, despite what's happening off their coast on oil and gas, are really hoping that they can keep their heads down and that they're far enough away that China won't notice them and let them carry on. So yeah, it's a little early to know where Muhyiddin is going to go, but he's following basically what Mahathir started 2 years ago, a year and a half ago.
Thanks. So we've got no problem. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we can always run a couple over. But let's switch gears to the whole bucket of questions we have related to the U.S. So Don Emerson from Stanford asked whether or not you think that a Biden administration would be likely to return to something like the Obama administration pivot. Relatedly, we've got Bhavin Jaipragas with SCMP and Jeff Moon both asking whether or not Biden administration, Michael Anderson asking whether or not a Biden administration would likely return to TPP. I guess more broadly, what do you think we're likely to see after the election? And if you're comfortable with it, which way do you think a lot of our Southeast Asian friends would like to see us lean?
Did anybody notice what the title of my book was? There's no US in the title at all. But anyway, so if you look at some of the advisors to Biden, and if you look at Biden's own history as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he is an internationalist for sure. But of course, the environment has changed so sharply since the elections in 2016, where suddenly foreign trade became a dirty word or something. And you know, I think Biden would have a hard time going back to the TPP. That would be a non-starter. Even Democrats on the Hill, Republicans who are often the most supportive, have a lot of problems with international trade. His big priority will be to deal with China. And will he deal with China in ways that are not only throwing tariffs at him, but you know, insulting him, but will he also look for ways maybe to make alliances with Southeast Asians, with Japan, with Australia, with the EU, and work Germany and put a lot of pressure on China on some of these issues, IP and technology transfer and all those kinds of things, and use of SOEs. But I think that he will be, I think he will recognize the importance of ASEAN and APEC. He hosted some of the leaders that visited while he was vice president. I remember going to a lunch that he hosted for the Vietnamese Communist Party chief. You know, so I think he will be more engaging, but will it be the old pivot? I don't think so. But really, you know, what people say on their during the campaign, what they say on their website really is very rarely totally implemented. So I guess I'm betting that he'll be more engaged and know where Southeast Asia is, but exactly how that will be interpreted when he's got to deal with the COVID, the economic recovery, China, Russia. Yeah, I'm hoping he will get more engaged. And I think those of us that are Southeast Asian should find ways to make it clear to the new people that come in how important Southeast Asia is.
Thanks. Let's bend it back toward China then. Kriti Vasudeva from Stimson Center asked what you make of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was, I think, largely seen as a response to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, the freedom of Indo-Pacific. But I mean, what does this say about ASEAN's approach to China? How much does it suggest that ASEAN priorities are actually related or not related? I mean, how much congruence is there with U.S. priorities in the region? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I should have just mentioned, I think you said in your question from Don, that, you know, what do Southeast Asians think? You know, I should mention that some of the more authoritarian governments actually do like Trump. You know, they like this fake news, Hun Sen and Duterte like this fake news stuff. I think Vietnam doesn't mind that Trump is putting a little more pressure on the Chinese. So they're really all over the place. But and then the more democratic ones, you know, like Indonesia, probably feel a little uncomfortable with where the Trump administration has gone. Greg, I'm getting senile. What was the question again?
Sorry, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. How much do you think that has to do with China? How much was it a response to the U.S.? Is it going to outlive the Trump administration?
Yeah, good question. They looked. So they did their own response, but you notice their own response was not quite the same as that. Neither was Japan's as that of the Trump administration. So they liked the focus and they liked the broadening to cross to two oceans, but from the Pacific to the Indian. But they thought a little bit too much of it was many of them thought a little bit too much of it was aimed at China, and they really didn't want to get into a U.S. Umbrella outfit, that umbrella concept that was going to be aimed solely at China. So they you know, the Indonesians, the Thais have written various things, but it's not giving the Trump administration's view of the Indo-Pacific a full endorsement. And there is almost no way that Biden would use this term. Trump couldn't stand the rebalance to Asia, and I don't think that Biden will be able to stand the Indo-Pacific concept either.
Gotcha. Let's give the last word to Situ Lemay. So Situ asked, Situ's with East West Center and CNA. Based on your research, what is your assessment of Southeast Asian views of the U.S. commitment and interest in the region vis-a-vis China's? How reliant, I think what he's getting is how reliant is the U.S. Interest in the region on U.S.-China relations, right? How much is it purely an artifact of Sino-U.S. competition? And how do Southeast Asians view that?
Well, that's a big question, Satu, about what Southeast Asians often wonder exactly what their role is. You know, and does the U.S. suddenly make very strong statements, which some Southeast Asian countries like very much on the South China Sea, but is that really to protect the South China Sea, or is that to stick it to China again? So they feel, a lot of them feel that because, like I said earlier, the U.S. is occasionally, sometimes involved, that sporadically involved, that the U.S. views Southeast Asia as a little bit of an appendage to their China policy. But you know, they also recognize that that President Trump has visited Vietnam several times, has had a lot of leaders from Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia visit, and so it's a little bit of a mixed bag. But they wish the U.S. could view Southeast Asia separately as just an important entity that has a population half the size of China and has a GDP, over $2 trillion, and it's significant in its own, and it lies along the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So it's a really important region.
All right, well, thanks, Murray. We're just about at time. We have another 21 questions in the queue, so I'd encourage everybody who didn't get a chance to ask a question to call Murray directly, show up at his house, come to his future book launches. He'll be happy to answer the questions. Murray, thanks for giving us the opportunity, one of the first opportunities to talk about the book. I hope everybody on here goes out and picks up a copy of Under Beijing's Shadow. And with that, you know, from your homes, please give Murray a big round of applause. Murray, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Greg. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate you moderating this.
Thanks.
Get some
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for the good questions. Take care.